dia para todos. É um prazer enorme ter vocês aqui hoje para a nossa palestra inaugural desse evento, Cartografias da Crise. Antes de começar, eu gostaria de dar dois avisos rápidos. Vai aparecer no chat um link para acessar o formulário vocês devem preencher em cada sessão que vocês assistirem para poder ter depois o certificado de participação. Então, por favor, prestem atenção no chat para clicar o link quando ele aparecer. Bom, eu tenho um outro aviso que, naturalmente, eu já esqueci, mas a gente volta para isso daqui a pouco. Sim. Durante a palestra, vocês já podem colocar questões, perguntas, dúvidas, comentários para a professora Baccolini. A gente vai encaminhar essas questões depois para discutir na sessão de debate logo depois da palestra. Tá? Então, por favor, fiquem à vontade para fazer perguntas ao longo de toda a apresentação. Então, agora eu tenho um prazer enorme de receber a professora Raffaella Baccolini. Um prazer e uma honra que ela esteja abrindo o nosso evento. A professora Raffaella Baccolini é uma das principais autoridades sobre distopia no mundo, então é realmente fantástico poder contar com ela aqui e uma honra enorme. Não sei até que ponto seria necessário fazer uma apresentação, mas eu vou fazer uma apresentação muito curta. Raffaella Baccolini é professora titular do Departamento de Interpretação e Tradução da Universidade de Bologna. Publicou diversos artigos sobre utopia, distopia, ficção científica, literatura feminina e literatura juvenil, entre outros assuntos. É membro do conselho editorial dos periódicos Utopian Studies e Spaces of Utopia, além de ser coeditora da revista online Mediazone e da série Rollheim Utopian Studies, da editora Peter Lang. Coeditou vários livros, entre os quais Dark Horizons, Science Fiction and the Dystopian Imagination, de 2003, e Utopian Method Vision, The User Value of Social Dreaming, de 2007, os dois em colaboração com Tom Moylan. Então, Professor Baccolini, it's an honor to have you here, and you have the table. It's going to be a pleasure listening to you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to all of you for attending, and to Julia Braga Neves and André Cardoso, and all the people working behind the screen who organized this conference and made it possible. So I'm honored to take part in this conference. But before I start, I would like to take a moment and address what it means to be utopian. Tom Moylan and I were posed this question back a couple of years ago, in 2020, by our Brazilian friends and colleagues during the Diálogos Fantásticos Symposium. And being a student of Utopia and Dystopia means for me to try to become an agent of radical change, to be an activist both inside and outside the university, to teach and continue to learn, and to engage with utopianism as a means of opposing privilege and discrimination and work collectively. So I'm thankful that you're giving me the chance to speak about a subject that is very important to me today. As I was preparing this talk, I was reminded once more of something that I've always believed. We are what we write and what we choose to read. Something I also found echoed in Lyman Tower Sargent's words that you can read in the first slide of my presentation. I don't know if you, yeah, great, thank you very much. If you can turn the slide. Sargent, as I was saying, I found echoed in Lyman Tower Sargent's words when he says, we should be aware of our personal relationship to utopia. It should be part of who we are, and perhaps more importantly, who we want to be and are trying to be. For these reasons, today I will offer a reflection of on the genre of dystopia, how it has changed its constituent elements and their transformations, with a specific look at its gender dimension and the issue of women's reproductive rights, an issue that I believe represents one of today's crises. In my work, I have proposed a critical interpretation of dystopian literature in its formal and thematic features, while trying to look for other modes of articulating horizons of hope. Together with many others, I've come to believe that contemporary dystopian production, which I've called dystopia, critical dystopia, in its themes and in its formal aspects, is an example of an oppositional and resisting form of writing, one that maintains hope and a utopian horizon within the pages of dystopia in these very dark times. What I'm going to read today has greatly benefited in the past 30 years or so from long conversations with Tom Moylan, Rita Monticelli, Lyman Tower Sargent, and more recently, all the friends and colleagues that are part of the Dystopia Collective, Trish McManus, Phil Wegner, whom I know will join you soon, Anthony Spalazopoulos, Lawrence Davis, to name just a few, have also helped shape my thinking in these years. As an Italian woman who completed her doctoral work in the United States with a focus on American high modernist poetry, my approach to utopian studies has been shaped by my cultural and biographical circumstances, as well as by my geography. It is therefore a hybrid method that brings together other elements like desire, memory, and intellectual curiosity with these geographical, cultural, and historical contexts. In particular, my interest in feminist theory and in writings by women has intersected with my conviction that the function of good literature is to disturb and unsettle readers. I believe that a feeling of being out of place, not at home in the world, is a necessary condition of utopia and of the desire to contribute to the transformation of society. It is an approach that has foregrounded from the very beginning issues of genre writing as they intersect with gender and the deconstruction of high and low culture. Such an approach, however, has and must also come to terms with the political and cultural circumstances that have characterized the recent years. Borrowing the words of Ursula K. Le Guin's 2000 novel, The Telling, I've called myself a child of conflict. I belong to the generation of the 70s, a generation marked, like the rest of my country, by the years of lead, which refer to the attacks from the extreme left by the Red Brigades that between 1976 and 1982 killed almost 100 people, and the bombings by extreme right terrorists and state apparatuses that from 1969 on killed many more people. While I have no direct recollection of the rallies linked to the 1968 student movement, I cannot forget the black and white pictures of the fascist bombs in Piazza Fontana in Milan on December 12, 1969. I do remember the heavy atmosphere of the daily tallies on the news at night when the country was informed of how many people had been injured or killed during terrorist actions. Such a biography explains, I think, some of the reasons for my preference for dystopian fiction over utopian literature. Dystopia speaks to me more than the utopias of the 60s and early 70s. And this is one of the reasons why I have become interested in the production of dystopia, and to a certain extent, it is also one of the elements that has shaped my approach to utopian studies. In fact, I have found in dystopia, and critical dystopia in particular, an example of a new oppositional and resisting form of writing, one that maintains a utopian horizon within the pages of dystopia in these very dark times. Starting with the conservative reactions of the 1980s, utopia has been under attack. At the same time, however, it has been co-opted. Often, in these unquestionably anti-utopian times, utopia has been conflated with materialist satisfaction, leading to its commodification and devaluation. In a society where consumerism and immediate gratification have come to represent the contemporary modality of happiness, utopia has apparently lost its relevance. And yet, the pursuit of individual happiness, which is none other than material success, corresponds to what Darko Suvin has called the Disneyfication strategy. For these reasons, in my approach, I try to find ways to highlight the transgressive and radical nature of some of the literature being written today, as we need to develop a critical perspective that can point us toward action and change. And I've come to believe that in order to recover utopia, we need to move away from the simple pursuit of happiness, hence my interest in memory and nostalgia as an active drive, as I think and as I've argued that utopia requires a sense of discomfort, one lesson that Joanna Russ had already pointed us toward in her powerful story, When It Changed. I started off by saying that I think what we write and what we choose to read shapes who we are in some ways. Marge Piercy made a comment that strikes me for its clarity and simplicity. If you could turn to the next slide, please. When I was a child, I first noticed that neither history, as I was taught it, nor the stories I was told, seemed to lead to me. I began to fix them. I've been at it ever since. To me, it is an important task to situate ourselves in the timeline so that we may be active in history. We require a past that leads to us. After any revolution, history is rewritten, not just out of partisan zeal, but because the past has changed. Similarly, what we imagine we are working toward does a lot to define what we will consider doable action aimed at producing the future we want and preventing the future we fear. I need stories that speak to me, and I believe that we may still draw inspiration today from critical dystopian stories to imagine the future we desire and stop the future we fear. I would like to turn to a quotation by Virginia Woolf, even though she's not a figure traditionally associated with dystopian science fiction. If you could turn to the next slide, please. The quotation is Woolf's by now famous statement that on or about December 1910, human character changed. All human relations have shifted. Those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there is at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature. I started with this quote because I believe we are in the midst of one of those historical moments, an event or crisis that has disrupted the appearance of normality, changing not only relationships, but also literature and dystopia in particular. As a result, this moment provides an opportunity to rethink our assumptions. Moments of crisis, like armed conflicts, political transitions, or even watershed events like the 9/11 attacks or the recent pandemic, have always had a strong impact and have produced significant transformations in identities, gender roles, and relations. While so much has changed regarding the role of women in private and public life, as well as in the social context, notions of masculinity that are a barrier to gender equality have been challenged too. But the struggle often results in an effort to take back control of female roles, bodies, and sexualities. Considering, for example, a watershed event that has shaken the confidence of many, such as September 11, several studies have investigated the gender nature of the psychological response to the attacks. Susan Faludi's The Terror Dream, for example, has described the post-9/11 age as an era of reconstituted traditional manhood, redomesticated femininity, and nuclear family togetherness. Faludi claims that, in response to the event, the American media, entertainment, and advertising blamed the attacks on women's liberation and the ensuing feminization of American men, which left the nation vulnerable. The myth of cowboy arrogance and feminine weakness, revived every time the nation felt vulnerable, was restored once again through fables of female peril and the rescue of just one girl, with the intention of displacing Americans' insecurity. While American men were cast back in the role of heroes, the ideal post-9/11 American woman was instead undemanding, uncompetitive, and dependent, recast as a mere victim deprived of agency. This conservative retreat to the mid-1950s culture has affected even the dystopian genre, producing texts where the gender narrative is split along the lines of invincible manhood, and more specifically, manly protectiveness and fatherhood, and jeopardized femininity. I'm thinking here of films like War of the Worlds, Spielberg's adaptation of War of the Worlds, but also Cloverfield or Cormac McCarthy's adaptation, The Road, as well. Even closer to home is the recent US Supreme Court's decision to overturn Roe v. Wade, the ruling that declared abortion a constitutional right in 1973. As has been said, the majority of America's low-income women and women of color will pay the price for this disgraceful decision. With this ruling, the court has outlawed abortion in 13 states, forcing women in conservative states to incur significant personal and financial difficulties by traveling large distances in search of safe abortion facilities if they will not be prosecuted for their choices. The heaviest burden will fall on low-income women. Obstacles in accessing adequate medical care will lead to unwanted pregnancies, or, in a bizarre twist, to get abortions much later in pregnancy, with higher costs and personal risks, with research showing that women in America denied abortions experience a spike in financial hardship, including debt, bankruptcies, and eviction. And it may further increase America's maternal mortality rates, already the highest in the industrialized world. The Supreme Court's ruling has therefore not ended abortion, but only the possibility of safe abortions in some part of the US. It has also intensified the polarization between the states over fundamental human rights, thus damaging the lives of millions of women. What follows then is a reflection on the dystopian genre, how it has changed its elements and their transformations, with a focus on the theme of women's reproductive rights and self-determination, a theme which has been prominently featured in several works by women writers and will become even more so in the near future as a result of the current situation. Before I venture into the matter of definitions, it is necessary to say that they are intellectual constructs. They include and therefore also exclude, but as Utopia's most prominent bibliographer, Lyman Tower Sargent, has reminded us, and if you could turn to the next slides, thanks, they are rarely or ever useful at the extremes, and the boundaries established by definitions are both movable and porous or permeable. But for certain purposes, for example, bibliography, boundaries are necessary. And so are definition, I would say. The notion of genre carries with it the binary opposition between original and derivative, hence superior and inferior, with an implied validation of the former over the latter. As feminist scholars, we might want to question the very notion of genre, boundaries, and exclusionary politics, and to investigate instead the intersection of gender and generic fiction, and the ways in which gender enters into and is constructed by the form of the genre, and in turn helps to create new texts. Genres have specific rules, conventions, and expectations, and until recently, a writer's art was shown through their faithful observation of such norms. Next slide, please. According to Frederick Jameson, Genres are essentially literary institutions or social contracts between a writer and a specific public, whose function is to specify the proper use of a particular cultural artifact. Thus, the history of literary genres, says Tom Moylan, allows us to understand a given literary work not only as an individual text subject to immanent analysis, but also as one which can be further understood historically in terms of the evolution of the particular form and of the societal events and contradiction of which it is a part. But genres, Jameson continues, are also clearly implicated in the literary history and form of production they were traditionally supposed to classify and neutrally describe. Since Aristotle's Poetics, in fact, genre theory has been concerned with the delimitation of boundaries as well as the hierarchizing of genres. But as Celeste Schenck has pointed out in her essay on women's poetry and autobiography, what seems to be just a literary theory is actually drenched in ideologies. Next slide, please. For Schenck, and rightly so, the ordering of genres has rested upon much more than aesthetic. Traditionally viewed as purely aesthetic markers, genres have been highly politicized, not only gendered, but also class biased and racially biased in the long history of Western literary criticism, a phenomenon that has had enormous implication for the banishment of women writers and other marginalized groups from the canon. Genres, like definitions, are cultural constructs. Implied in the notion of genre and boundaries lies a binary opposition between what is normal and what is deviant, a notion that feminist criticism has attempted to deconstruct, since this difference relegates feminine practice to inferiority. Moreover, Western genre theory remains for the most part prescriptive and legislative, as its main preoccupation continues to be the establishment of limit, boundaries, and exclusion. Because of this, women writers have had to resist and possibly revise the largely masculine literary tradition with its notions of well-defined genres, while feminist critics have exposed different issues regarding women's writing, canon formation, and genre theory. In particular, feminist criticism has focused on how women were marginalized into non-canonical genres, on women's use of generic forms traditionally dominated by men, and women's use of genres of their own, although feminist theory has also questioned the very establishment of genre and its consequences. Feminist appropriations of generic texts, on the other hand, have become radical revisions of conservative genres. While some contemporary women writers carry out a conscious revision and reappropriation of generic texts from a feminist perspective, some others employed similar strategies well before Adrienne Rich's notion of revision became a conscious methodological approach in women's studies. Anne Cranny Francis, in fact, points out that the use of generic fiction as a form of political resistance has a long history. What these women share, whether consciously or not, is the manipulation of genre conventions and the rejection of high-low culture classification. Such an undertaking becomes an oppositional strategy, a site of resistance against the hegemonic ideology that, among other things, sees women and other marginalized groups linked with the notion of deviance and inferiority. As far as dystopia is concerned, the intersection of gender and genre has been of paramount importance for the development of the genre. Themes such as the representation of women and their bodies, reproduction and sexuality, and language and its relation to identity have helped to challenge and denounce stereotypes and damaging notions about women and/or gendered identities. Interventions on the convention of dystopia have also contributed to the transformation of the genre, what I initially called open-ended or critical dystopias, which has become a flourishing genre since the 1980s and in particular in recent years. In the three phases of Utopia Revisited, Sargent defines dystopia, and I quote, as a non-existent society described in considerable detail and normally located in time and space that the author intended a contemporaneous reader to view as considerably worse than the society in which the reader lived, unquote. In Sargent's definition, dystopia is then a textual form. By the middle of the 20th century, dystopias became the dominant form of utopian literature. In my own work, and then together with Tom Moylan, Sargent, Ilney Cavalcanti, Ruth Levitas, Lucy Sargison, Phil Wegner, Darko Suving, and all the contributors to Dark Horizons, we have examined the emergence, particularly in the late 80s, though we found examples before and certainly after, of what we have collectively decided to call the critical dystopia. We trace the origin of this formal development of the literary dystopia to the neoliberal principles of the 1980s as a reaction both to the times and their values. While maintaining the familiar narrative structure of the dystopia, these novels offer a capacity for narrative that creates the possibility for social critique and utopian anticipation in the dystopian text. The new critical dystopias describe a mostly dystopian future society, but they also portray surviving utopian enclaves within the larger dystopian world. By changing the traditional tragic ending of classical dystopias, the critical dystopias maintain the utopian impulse at the level of form. Next slide, please. Traditionally a bleak, depressing genre with no space for hope within the story, utopian hope is maintained in dystopia only outside the story. It is only if we consider dystopia as a warning that we as readers can hope to escape such a pessimistic future. This option is not granted to the protagonists of George Orwell's 1984 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Winston Smith, Julia, John the Savage, and Lenina are all crushed by the totalitarian society. There is no learning, no escape for them. Conversely, the new critical dystopias allow readers and protagonists to hope by resisting closure. The ambiguous, open, and today I would add precarious endings of these novels maintain the utopian impulse within the work. Next slide, please. In fact, by rejecting the traditional subjugation of the individual at the end of the novel, the critical dystopia opens a space of contestation and opposition for those collective, eccentric subjects whose class, gender, race, sexuality, and other positions are not empowered by hegemonic rule. Therefore, we argued that the critical dystopian form, both in its 1980s transformation and as a generic category that can still be applied today, offers both a criticism and a transformation of the present by exploring the struggles of small groups that act both individually and collectively. In so doing, these texts refresh the links between imagination and utopia and utopian awareness in decidedly pessimistic times. They preserve radical action, create a space in which opposition can be articulated and received, and allow us to continue to recover hope in darkness. Thus, dystopia remains for me fundamentally a term for a distinct literary genre, with its particular history, political engagement, and its formal characteristics, but also its evolving form. In fact, if my understanding of dystopia has changed over the years, since the historical and material conditions and the use of dystopia have also changed, the fact that dystopia is a narrative textual practice, whereby textual, I mean both literary or filmic text, for example, has remained the same. The ambiguous, open ending is the most distinctive feature of the new critical dystopias. By challenging the traditional expectation that dystopias must end tragically, these texts also open spaces of resistance and maintain the utopian impulse within the story. But opposition can be articulated and received also through some other formal features and strategies typical of the genre. The dystopian text usually begins directly in the terrible new world, and yet the element of textual estrangement and the critique of society soon become clear, since on the one hand, the narrative often revolves around the protagonist who questions the dystopian society, and on the other, because of dystopia's narrative structure, a narrative of the hegemonic order and a counter-narrative of resistance. These two elements are essential in making the critical dystopian form a concrete tool of resistance and critique. Next slide, please. As we have observed in Dark Horizon, since the text opens in medias res with the nightmarish society, cognitive and political estrangement are at first reduced by the immediacy and normality of the location. No dream or trip is taken to get to this place of everyday life. The protagonist and the reader is always already in the world in question, unreflectively immersed in the society. However, a counter-narrative develops as the dystopian citizen moves from apparent contentment into an experience of alienation and resistance. Or, in what Tom Moylan has recently called, in Becoming Utopian, a break or gestalt shift from their well-adjusted subjectivity to the radically free, self-actualizing utopian agency. Next slide. The structural strategy of narrative and counter-narrative most often plays out by way of the social and antisocial use of language. The official hegemonic order of most dystopias rests, as Antonio Gramsci put it, on both coercion and consent. A central feature of dystopian novels is, in fact, the use of language as a tool to control and therefore manipulate truth and reality. The dystopian citizens are more or less prohibited from using language, and when they do, it means nothing, words having been reduced to a propaganda tool. Apparently, the new society uses language, usually accompanied by the erasure of past and memory, in order to avoid all ambiguity and create the official, true version of history. But in fact, the dystopian regime greatly manipulates facts in order to create just another fiction of history. This new fiction is presented as the only one, and above all, as non-fictional. That is, the new narrative becomes the truth. It becomes the master narrative. The reappropriation of language remains one of the dystopian protagonists' tools to understand and criticize their society and to unmask its fiction. Recovery of history and literacy and individual and collective memory become instrumental tools of resistance for the protagonists of dystopias. Because authoritarian, hegemonic discourse shapes the narrative about the past and collective memory to the point that individual memory has been erased, individual recollection becomes the first necessary step for a collective action. Taking control over the means of language, representation, and memory become crucial weapon and strategy in moving dystopian resistance from an initial individual consciousness to actions which may attempt to change society. As opposed to the plot of dislocation, education, and return of the visitor of Utopia, Dystopia then produces its own story in the critical encounter that takes place when the protagonist confronts or is confronted by the contradiction of the society that is present from the very beginning. There are three other constituents of the dystopian genre that need to be addressed. Genre blurring, the link between hope and precarity, and the feeling of discomfort. While genre blurring is part of my early work on the critical dystopia, the last two are more recent and are linked to my work on the commodification of dystopia. Genre blurring is another strategy that makes these novels sites of resistance and oppositional texts. By borrowing specific conventions from other genres, critical dystopias more often blur the established boundaries of the dystopian form and thereby expand its creative potential for critical expression. Drawing on the feminist criticism of universalist assumptions, fixity and singularity, and neutral and objective knowledge, and recognizing the importance of differences, multiplicity and complexity, partial and situated knowledges, as well as hybridity and fluidity, the critical dystopias resist genre purity in favor of an impure or hybrid text, which renovates dystopia by making it formally and politically oppositional. Thus, for example, Octavia Butler's Kindred revises the convention of the time travel story and creates a novel that is both science fiction and slave narrative, while her Parable series combines survivalist science fiction with the diary and the slave narrative. Similarly, Margaret Atwood employs the convention of the diary and the epistolary novel to narrate the life of her protagonist in, obviously, The Handmaid's Tale. Furthermore, her novel and the sequel, The Testaments, can be seen as literature of witness. By fragmenting the narrative of the future society with the narrative of 16th century Prague, Pierce's He, She, and It creates a historical science fiction novel. And a recent novel, like Leni Zumas's Red Clocks, blurs the stories of four women with the fictional biography of a 19th century polar explorer. It is the very notion of an impure genre with permeable borders, which allow contamination from other genres, that represents resistance to hegemonic ideology and renovates the resisting nature of dystopia and makes it also oppositional. The last aspect that I want to concentrate on are precarious hope and discomfort. They are linked together, and I've always considered them necessary ingredients of dystopia. Next slide, please. Darren Webb, among others, has noted excuse me, the depoliticization and domestication of Bloch and his concept of hope. Bloch is the touchstone for countless studies which point to and celebrate traces of utopian hope to be found in the fabric of everyday life. An ever-growing number of conference papers take as their focus a television program, a pulp novel, a playground, a piece of music, fashion design, gaming, the performative of a play, and use Bloch as a means of uncovering the traces of hope to be found there. But no project is suggested, no politics stems from these studies, no course of action is developed. Traces of hope are simply pointed to or pointed at. The realization that utopia had been commodified and domesticated is certainly not new. As others have already noted, among whom Ruth Levitas, the concept of utopia has been applied too generously, even within the field of utopian studies, where, for example, the fulfillment of material yearnings has come to represent instances of utopian desire. What we're witnessing today is the appropriation and commodification of dystopia as well. Dystopian fiction has become extremely popular and even mainstream, especially after the success of Suzanne Collins' Hunger Games trilogy and the rediscovery of Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, also thanks to the huge success of its TV adaptation by Hulu after 2016. Another example of this co-optation is the proliferation of dystopian and post-apocalyptic TV series. Even more problematic appropriations of dystopia are represented by the now withdrawn Halloween sexy handmaid costume or the various Handmaid's Tale theme party and fashion. These examples represent a form of appropriation where something transgressive and radical is taken, tamed, co-opted, neutralized, and commodified. Repressing women's reproductive rights becomes a game, and dystopia becomes a place that readers can casually visit, party in, and then emerge from as untouched. The cooptation of dystopia destroys the recognition of vulnerability and precarity, which are constituents of the genre, by reassuring its audience and by moving these features into security zones of middle and high-class conformism and consumerism. Against the depoliticization of dystopia, of Bloch, and of his notion of hope, I think it is necessary to remember that hope is, for Bloch, the opposite of security. One thing that I've always found problematic is the commodification of in the commodification of utopia is the idea that the mere pursuit of happiness is necessary to reach utopia. I do believe instead that a feeling of being out of place, not at home in the world, is a necessary condition of utopia. In my work on critical nostalgia, I spoke of a slight suffering as necessary to pursue change. Today, I would revise my notion as one of discomfort. From slight suffering, I would use the word discomfort. The presence of utopian hope, as I've said, does not need a consoling and comforting happy ending. Rather, discomfort seems to be the precondition of hope. Discomfort and the precarity of hope are the conditions of the citizens and the readers of dystopia. As the function of what I consider good literature is to disturb and unsettle. And here, I would agree with Sada Ahmed, who, in Living in a Feminist Life, invites us to stay unhappy in this world because, and I quote, happiness is used to justify social norms as social goods, unquote. The power to unsettle the readers and not to reassure them remains one of the key critical elements of dystopia and of critical dystopia specifically. It is what allows protagonists and hopefully readers alike to become utopian, to hark back to Tom Moylan's title. In the last part of my talk, I want to show that there is still a strong critical utopian output through today's critical dystopias. Despite the emptiness of complicit commodification, there are still critical dystopias that continue the work of critique and transformation, the kind of work that is most needed in times of crisis. But how have they changed? Because utopian literature is always a product of the historical and material conditions in which writers live, there have been changes both at the level of form and themes. As far as themes are concerned, some stand out and have to do with the crisis of our times, sometimes set in an alternative world, almost contemporaneous without the authors present. And if you could go to the next slide, please. These are some of the covers of recent dystopias. The climate emergency, including the spread of viruses, make up a consistent number of recent dystopian texts. Next slide. Due to the backlash on women's rights in many parts of the world, another issue that has seen a blooming of dystopian novels is the status and experience of women, with significant themes such as the ban on abortion, control of reproduction, infertility, and rape. Likewise, the experience of immigration and immigration finds space in contemporary dystopias, while the contested nature of a global electronic technology and culture is also treated. In these texts, the narrative develops in a critical dystopian mode, focusing on individuals that are at odds with the dystopian society. If hopeful, yet precarious and uncertain alternatives are still developed within the pages of these texts, the narrative moves are, however, often those of micro interventions and changes, small steps, sometimes highly personal. Such narratives are therefore fragmented and individual, and yet, by being developed through multiple points of view, for example, in the novels by Atwood, Zumas, Kim Stanley Robinson, Amit, Alderman, they generate a polyphonous text, which in turn calls for a collective rather than an individual agency. Finally, the presence of genre blurring is also maintained in some of these texts, as the dystopian narrative blurs elements with fantasy, magic realism, historical and realistic fiction, the diary, and the biographical genre. If the text on women's reproductive oppression is Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale, the theme of women's bodies and reproductive rights has always been present in women's production. Feminist dystopias focused on the attack on individual freedom by foregrounding, in particular, the issue of the violation of women's reproductive rights and the control of their bodies. Women's bodies and sexuality have traditionally been central to dystopian narratives. For instance, in classical dystopias, some female characters' bodies serve as disruptive forces for the male protagonists and, as a result, for the totalitarian regimes in which they live. Within the dystopian society conceived by Aldous Huxley or George Orwell, for example, whether sexuality is free, as in Huxley, or controlled, as in Orwell, women's bodies constitute a powerful subversive factor for the male protagonist who, stimulated by female sexuality, is prompted to question the ideology of the hegemonic system. However, while these female characters serve the male protagonist's rebellion, they themselves remain passive tools, devoid of self-awareness and unable to actively subvert society. You will all remember, I'm sure, Julia's fallen asleep while Winston talks about and reads about the past. Similarly, even in the future societies described in more recent dystopias, such as the cyberpunks of the 1980s, young women's bodies and sexuality often serve as dangerous stimuli for the male protagonists. And yet, the critique of societies, patriarchal and totalitarian, in these dystopian texts often does not address the relationship between gender and power, a theme that is prevalent, by contrast, in many dystopian novels by women. By setting their narratives in an oppressive future, in past society, or in hyper-technological worlds, women's dystopias identify in the critique and reappropriation of women's sexuality and bodies a crucial means of emancipation from patriarchy. Such revision is necessary for a critique of the patriarchal roots of totalitarianism and the abuse of technology, but also for the redefinition of female agency and subjectivity. Next slide, please. In dystopian novels by Catherine Burdekin, Susie McKee Zoe Fairbairn, Octavia Butler, Suzette Halden Elgin, and of course Atwood, but also the more recent ones that drew their inspiration from Atwood, the authors describe oppressive society in which reproduction is controlled or forced, thus showing how gender identities are the product of an androcentric and totalitarian discourse. The reduction of women to their biological function, even when performed in silence and passivity, for example, like in Swastika Night, is never an innate and essential quality, but is imposed on them by institutionalized rape and violence, and is constructed by the totalitarian discourse of male supremacy. Women dystopias, whether they were written in the 1930s and 40s or in more recent years, center on gender issues such as violence against women and women's reproductive function. Such topics are considered as being closely related to the cult of virility and the idea of masculinity, which are the foundation of totalitarian regimes. Indeed, these dystopias reveal the relationship between totalitarianism, violence, and gender discrimination. In doing so, they identify in the climate, rituals, and mindset of both the European extreme right of the 30s and 40s and the fundamentalist and populist forces of the present, some of the main threats to women's freedom and autonomy. It is therefore no coincidence that the dystopian narrative has become so popular again today. In the face of political events such as the violation of reproductive rights and women's choices, dystopia reemerges as a critique of the present. It is no surprising then that Atwood's novel, The Handmaid's Tale, has enjoyed a new life since 2016. years marked by a series of crises: Brexit, Trump's election, the rise of populism, increasing violence against women and non-binary people, the migrant crisis, ongoing conflicts and wars, ethnic and racial hatred, and the recent tightening of the laws on women's self-determination. Crises that have made Atwood's future society extremely relevant today. I've argued that Atwood's open ending in Offred's narrative marks, at the level of generic conventions, the most striking deviation from classical dystopias and opens a locus of hope within the dystopian text. With the ambiguous image of stepping into the darkness within or else the light, the Handmaid's narrative resists closure. The reader does not know whether for Offred this is her end or a new beginning. The space of ambiguity becomes a utopian space, and the novel's ending breaks dramatically with the absolute certainty of defeat in classical dystopias. Even if the final ambiguity is somewhat reduced in the epilogue, the historical notes, it is not altogether eliminated. Readers learn of Offred's survival and of the end of the Republic of Gilead only from outside the story, from the historical notes. But the fate of the narrator remains obscure. It is within the contrast between epilogue and narrative, the former with its resistance to ambiguity and the latter with its acceptance, that Atwood's novel maintains ambiguity and awareness as central element of the critical dystopia. The epilogue, in fact, provides a sense of relief through its account of the end of Gilead and the handmaid's survival. The name of the future city where the conference is held sometime in 2195, none of it evocative of the traditional names of utopian places like Nowhere and, of course, Utopia, suggests that the society could be a utopia. But the historical notes serve another important function. They warn the reader against rejoicing in an easily consolatory notion of utopia. They do show readers a possibly better future compared to Gilead's, but it is still an imperfect one, where sexism is present and scholars still believe that certain stories are better than others. Official history is still more interesting and hence more valuable than her story. In the epilogue, acceptance of hierarchy and the search for a neutral, complete understanding that could eliminate all ambiguity represent those problematic values that need to be resisted and that make Gilead only an exaggerated, horrifying version of pre- and post-Gilead societies. Atwood's novel deconstructs the epilogue and its values by juxtaposing them with The Handmaid's Tale. In the space of utopian resistance opened by The Handmaid's Tale with its narrative non-closure, readers are encouraged to read critically and value Offred's personal history. They learn to see in her personal and private anguish the product of social, political, and economic forces. In the remarkable output of Dystopia of our times, one of the most interesting examples of how dystopia can recover hope in darkness out of precarity, discomfort, unsettling endings, awareness, and responsibility is Lenny Zumas's Red Clocks, which was published in 2018. A provocative exploration of female longing, frustration, and determination. The future imagined by Zumas in this novel is not as extreme as other feminist dystopias recently published, but it shares with them the violation of reproductive rights. And yet, as Ron Charles has remarked, and I quote, "The ordinariness of the world that Zumas imagines is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of this lyrical novel," unquote. At the heart of the novel are the stories of four women whose lives intertwine as they come to terms with an imagined America that in the last month has become very similar to today's situation. Abortion is illegal, in vitro fertilization is banned, a fetal personhood law grants embryos full rights, and a law prohibiting adoption for unmarried individuals is about to be passed. Next slide, please. In the voice of Raw, one of the four female protagonists, it is the voice of Raw who explains the situation. 2 years ago, the United States Congress ratified the Personhood Amendment, which gives the constitutional right to life, liberty, and property to a fertilized egg at the moment of conception. Abortion is now illegal in all 50 states. Abortion providers can be charged with second-degree murder, abortion seekers with conspiracy to commit murder. In vitro fertilization, too, is federally banned because the amendment outlaws the transfer of embryos from laboratory to uterus. The embryos can give their consent to be moved. As if this were not enough, a pink wall divides the US border from Canada to prevent women to get an abortion there, where Canadian women's rights are still guaranteed. As Zumas herself revealed in an interview, all the restrictions she imagined were based on real proposals by American politicians, such as Republicans Mike Pence and Paul Ryan, proposals that, under the Trump-Pence administration, no longer seemed to be extreme, but became real threats, and that Trump's nomination of 3 conservative justices to the Supreme Court have recently made painfully real. Next slide, please. Pence is one of the politicians who helped me imagine our current hell. As governor of Indiana, he sought to discipline and punish the bodies of women and LGBTQ people. In 2005 and 2007, he co-sponsored federal legislation that would recognize human zygotes as legal persons, thereby outlawing not only abortion, but certainly fertility treatments and all non-barrier forms of contraception. In 2016, Pence signed a bill, later blocked by a federal judge, that would require women who have miscarriages or abortion to pay for the fetus funeral. Another radical conservative who gave me ideas for red clocks is Paul Ryan, a longtime proponent of so-called Personhood Amendments. He co-sponsored the 2013 Sanctity of Human Life Act, which would grant full legal rights to a fertilized human egg. The effects of this situation on the lives of the individual characters raise the awareness of the oppressive society and initiate a narrative trajectory that moves from apparent containment into an experience of alienation and resistance, and then into the possibility of radical utopian agency. Awareness is the first step. Zumas's character regret not acting in time and being simple bystander, those ordinary citizens who are aware but do nothing. In addition to Rose, a high school teacher desperately trying to have a child on her own while writing the biography of a fictitious 19th century polar explorer, other narrative voices include Susan, a wife-mother trapped in an unhappy marriage, Mattie, one of Rose's best students who finds herself pregnant and seeks an abortion, and Jin, the queer lesbian healer whose arrest and trial for her activities contribute to bringing all the women together. The four women's voices and lives are intertwined to tell the tale of a community, a mosaic of imperfect and complex women's experiences, where women who defy social convention are strengthened through alliances and solidarity, or to put it in another way, through interdependence. Through the story of the bonds between women who can be as supportive as they are competitive, the novel depicts the conflicting but valid feelings that every woman who desires or experiences pregnancy and motherhood may have. In particular, every woman is faced with difficult and complicated choices, intrinsically linked to a self-determination that in the novel is threatened not only by the laws, but also by personal dilemmas and biases that the women have about themselves and that they imagine the community also has about them. In short, by those cultural imperatives that determine the expectation about what a woman should be or should desire. Thus, the novel manages to maintain the complexity of the different positions of the four female characters without judging the choice of carrying a pregnancy to term, ending it, or adopting a child. Zumas does not choose with what would be the possibility of adoption, the easier and more comforting and compensatory way of a private accommodation between Rose's yearning for motherhood and Mattie's desire not to become a mother. Instead, the novel The novel's open ending allows each of her characters to face their choices and responsibilities, and in so doing, to embrace their contradiction and complexity and to desire more than just one thing. So that in Rose's voice, she will be able to see what it is and to see what is possible, thus opening the space of a precarious, fragile hope. This sense of precarious hope is, however, also accompanied by a new consciousness of the need for resistance. Among Rose's future proposal, there is also the resolution to go to the protest in May, followed by the realization that it will also be necessary to do more than go to a protest. Rose comes to realize that in the present situation, it is essential to work outside the apparatus, like the rebellious women of the Polifonte Collective, a guerrilla abortion clinic who illegally assists women in reproductive choices. Rose thus completes her journey from alienation and discomfort into active resistance. Although Zumas's novel has been criticized because, according to some reviewers, it is not a feminist classic, for it ignores, but I would say it deals with, on its own terms, marginalized communities, I find Zumas's perceived shortcomings an honest approach. Zumas has been criticized for failing to include in her story women of color, trans characters, and women with disabilities. I fear that such criticism runs the risk of requiring of each work of art to be prescriptively representative in a move that at worst can end up with a tokenistic representation of each marginalized subjectivity. Zumas explains, in this novel, and I quote, and beyond, I want my work to face the trouble of whiteness, how it's being constructed, how its power is maintained, how we could imagine dismantling that power. Unquote. I don't think good literature should tell people what to think. It should try to make us think critically, also by failing to write exactly what we would like. Critique of and desire to transform our present are the constituents of the dystopian genre. Using challenging themes, complex visions, and unsettling endings, writers of dystopias can motivate readers. As Jack Zipes also reminds us, and I quote, without discontent, there is no utopia, unquote. We must feel out of place, not at home in the world, and we need dystopias to mobilize us, to own the discomfort that will educate us into a displacement from and critique of the society we live in. Reading dystopias can promote critical thinking and foster hope for change. Thus, the precariousness of open endings serves to disturb, challenge, and motivate readers. By resisting the convention of reassuring readers, the futures foreshadowed in dystopian novels do not foreclose hope. They actually mobilize readers to intervene critically in the imagination and construction of a future they desire and to possibly do something in their present that can begin to build that future. The critical dystopia then stresses the connection between imagination and critique. Discomfort, awareness, resistance, solidarity, and interdependence are necessary to activate precarious hope. When combined, they are the tools of the critical dystopia with which we can crack the darkness, let the light in, and begin to dismantle the master's house, to use an expression from Audre Lorde. Critical dystopias then provide a means to analyze and critique the present and inspire a militant awakening with the potential for radical utopian agency. There are two quotations that, for me, sum up the extremely important work of literature, and particularly dystopia, in recovering hope today and move to action in order to counter crisis. Next slide, please. The first is from Audre Lorde's essay, Poetry is Not a Luxury. Poetry, but by extension also art, literature, as well as critical dystopias, is a vital necessity of our existence. It forms the quality of the light within which we predicate our hopes and dreams towards survival and change, first made into language, then into idea, then into more tangible action. Next slide, please. The second is again from Marge Piercy and comes from an essay called Active in Time and History, a reflection about her own writing of political novels. Again, imagination is linked with understanding and acting, and literature becomes the place where readers are shaped and mobilized. Imagination is powerful, whether it's working to make us envision our inner strength and the vast energy and resources locked into ordinary people and capable of shining out in crisis, capable of breaking out into great good or great evil, or whether imagination is showing us utopias, dystopias, or merely societies in which some variable has changed. When such societies are imagined, we can better understand ourselves by seeing what we're not, to better grasp what we are. We can also then understand what we want to move toward and what we want to prevent in the worlds our children must inhabit. Finally, and I close, I want to conclude with a positive example of the power of critical dystopia today. I've mentioned earlier the appropriation of Atwood's iconic symbol, the handmaid's costume, but that symbol has also served to support political struggles around the world. The handmaid's costume continues, in fact, to be used in a number of protest demonstrations. Next slide, please. In Poland, for example, women took to the streets in protest against the government's decision to withdraw from the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe. Next. In Italy, in Perugia, for instance, women dressed as handmaids protested against the local government's decision to obstruct women's request for pharmacological abortion. In the United States, handmaids continued to regularly welcome former President Trump in the various destinations of his official visits and spurred the protests of transversal feminist groups such as Ni Una Menos. And recently, next please, members of the Boston Red Cloaks carried signs hung from clothing hangers to protest the Supreme Court draft decision and advocate for reproductive freedom. Offred and the handmaids have served activist women to form a resilient and fighting effective community. In this instance, identification has been able to sustain political movements and struggles in support of the common vulnerabilities caused by oppressive and reactionary forces, including those of despotic regimes, of those disguised as false democracies. Dystopia is thus not only an instrument for critical thinking, but a site of concrete and active resistance. In dark times, dystopian literature becomes even more important to us, providing both the tools and the incentive that we need to critically interpret and transform our present. Critical dystopias with their permeable borders, their invocation of precarity and discomfort, their resistance to closure, can still represent one of the preferred sites of resistance for our feminist utopian agenda, reminding us that the fight is not over. Thank you.
Professor Baccolini, thank you so much for your talk. I think it was really illuminating, and I already have several questions. I won't be able to ask all of them now. I hope we'll have other opportunities to continue this discussion in the future, because you've touched on several points that we in our study group on dystopia have been discussing now for a long time, and which I think are really essential to understand dystopia as such, but also to see dystopias as a means to discuss our present society or societies, and also to engage in some kind of action and change. I have a couple of questions. I don't even know exactly where to begin, but I think I would go straight to one of the heart of our discussions lately, and I think it's something that everybody who works with translation now is facing in a way. You've mentioned several times our present moment, and how it inflects the production of and reception of dystopias. And I was wondering if you could discuss this a little further. I mean, this relationship between dystopia as a fictional form and reality, the real. Because one of our private jokes in our discussions in our group is that we thought we were studying, investigating an extremely, let's say, imaginative form, more connected with the fantastic and science fiction, and suddenly we found ourselves discussing something very close to realism. And especially in our context here in Brazil, I think there is a formal, this is actually a formal problem, how to write a dystopia that is not simply a reflection of present reality or of past history. So my question would be something like, what is the difference? What is the difference that dystopia introduces that is more, let's say, desirable for some writers who engage in this genre or this form, as opposed to simply a realistic account of society cast in a negative, from a negative point of view? So what is this difference that dystopia introduces that makes it a powerful and attractive tool of resistance, both in its writing and its reception?
That's a great question, and I don't know if I have sufficient answer. But you're absolutely right, and I think I mean my own example, Red Clocks, which I consider a dystopia. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. As I said, is set in a very near future. So I think that one of the things of the recent dystopias that we're witnessing today is this, in a way, collapse of the distance, right, of the future. That futuristic element is less present. So much so that some of the dystopias could really take place, as you said. They're not that different from realistic novels. Some of them, I think, maintain. I'm thinking of Moshe Named. Maintain an element, or make that dystopian element, that unrealistic, or through the use of magic realism, through the use of fantasy. So again, blurring the genres, I would say, because I don't think that fantasy per se, is considered as one of the constituents of science fiction, or dystopian science fiction, in a way. Probably, and I would say that is the good thing about dystopia, and possibly, but also the risks, of dystopias. Is that by imagining, but anyway, by posing the story somehow in the future, as little as possible, or as far as possible. One of the risks of dystopia, on the one hand, one of the positive things of dystopia is the element of estrangement, and the way in which, you know, it forces the reader to recognize, you know, things of the present, you know, without actually without writing a didactic or you know, a didactic novel about the present. One of the risks of that posing, you know, or the novel in the future sometime, I think, especially in what has become a kind of dystopia mainstream, is the risk of what I was saying, you know, of reassuring, you know, the reader, well, this is going to happen, you know, in the future, so it's not, you know, one of my problems, and that may be, you know, one of the problems that we're facing today, in a way, this kind of reassuring stories where writing dystopias can exercise fears, right, without really mobilizing you know, the readership, or you know, to do something about it. So it's you know, it's one of the main problems, I think, of dystopia today, and of the great success of dystopia today. At least, you know, I see it that way. You know, the possibility of just enjoying dystopia, visit dystopia, and exit this, you know, and we are privileged. We can just read it and then close the book and think that it doesn't affect us. So that's a little bit of a problem of today's you know, mainstream dystopia, I would say. And to me, you know, I'm kind of repeating myself, but what makes dystopia interesting, it's when it unsettles the reader, does not, you know, provide consolation or happy ending, or you know, but, you know, maintains hope nonetheless, and creates the possibility for action. I don't know if I answered your question, though.
I think so. And again, there are several points there that I find interesting, especially in connection with this ability of dystopia to still create hope. And I think your talk was very, very interesting in pointing to the fact that hope requires discomfort and a sense of displacement. And in the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that nowadays you feel more attracted to dystopias than to utopias as such. And I'd like to hear from you a little bit more about that. Why that happens. And I was wondering whether there's something about the structure, the fictional game that dystopia suggests, offers, related to precisely this sense of discomfort, and whether there are other, let's say, attractions. Because I think nowadays it's a common, just, you know, it's a cliche that we see recurring again and again, that utopia is dead, that nobody cares for utopia anymore, that utopia is no longer, let's say, engaging or convincing. And I wonder if dystopia offers a kind of formal solution for some of the problems that I think we face nowadays in trying to imagine utopias. For instance, whether dystopias help ground utopia without relinquishing utopia, because this is a frequent mistake that people have, that you of course base your whole work on, that dystopias refuse utopias, which is not actually the case. What we see now,
Mm-hmm.
as you point out, is precisely the opposite, especially in critical dystopias. But whether dystopias can help ground utopias into history, which is also connected with this effect of estrangement, which Dr. Suvin actually explicitly associates with the creation of historicity, of locating the present as the future's past, and therefore inserting it into a historical development over time. Which also brings out another question, also connected to the way Suvin and Tower Sargent also employ the term of the concept of estrangement, which is the connection of the text with knowledge, of producing some kind of knowledge. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit on that, if that made any sense.
Yes. So I'm not sure where to start. Well, certainly, I think. Let's see. I'm trying to go back to the beginning of your comment. I think I tried to explain my attraction to dystopia, right? And I think perhaps it's an issue that speaks to the central question of your conference today, right? And how how differently we can read dystopia, or people can read dystopia and approach dystopia, from the, let's say, the mainstream, the British American tradition. And I know that you're looking in particular at dystopias from other countries, and it would be really interesting to see the result of your discussion. I think that is extremely important today to open up, the discussion to that. In terms of my own approach, as I said at the beginning, I think. I consider my approach somewhat a hybrid, right? Because of my political, geographical, cultural context, circumstances, as I said before. So those certainly account for my interest in dystopia, as I was saying earlier, and how dystopia, I think, not only obviously speaks to me, but I think speaks to the times in which we're living more than utopia does. But I think what is important is, and what you were also saying, is not to confuse, the interest in dystopia as a negation of the importance of utopia and of the utopian impulse. And so I don't think that dystopia can really provide answers, right? Specific, concrete answers to some extent, but it can certainly point us towards the importance of developing, finding answers, finding strategies. I was thinking while you were talking, and while you were talking about these answers or not, I was thinking of Le Guin, of Ursula Le Guin, who is one of my favorite, of course, writers, and of the ones who walk away from Omelas, the short stories, where, you know, I think there are, and again, that's a great example of different points of view, of depending on how you read that story and the ending of the story, of the people that leave the utopian city of Omelas, which is not a utopia, as a matter of fact, but it's a present, right? Is an indication of, you know, it's an indication of the importance, the necessity of keep looking for utopia, of walking towards utopia. You know, utopia is not something that you can actually reach, but it's something that you keep going toward to some extent. So that, I think, is one of the lessons of dystopias, or of the utopian message within the dystopias. And I'm not sure, but I certainly, you know, I think that you touched on an extremely important element. You know, when you were talking about Darko Suvin's notion of estrangement and historicity, that is, you know, for sure the you know, one of the main important things about dystopia, how, you know, in a way, the future, right, or our present, you know, will become the future if, you know, that is the point of dystopias, right? A kind of a warning that you know, we need to take care of our present if we don't want to develop that kind of future. So it's a wonderful, you know, critical way of looking at the present, and of engaging, I think, readers. And I would say something that you know, I hope I will never be quoted about it. You know, I'll say this. I think it's a wonderful way of engaging readers with, you know, I think dystopias are more attractive, more interesting, that they have more action in a way than utopias. You know, utopias are a little boring. You know, I never said that. I you know, don't quote on me, but that's, you know, my forbidden thought. Okay.
And I think it's an interesting thought, because actually it revolves around a more complex question, which is the idea of utopia, the desire for utopia, and the realization of utopia as a text, which are two different things. And
Oops.
That dystopias may be more attractive because of this action, which is not something superficial. I think one of the important aspects that you mention, not only in your talk, but to your answers to my question, is that dystopias are not a closed form. I think, as you point out, they train us, they educate us to ask the questions without actually providing the answers. And I think this is an interesting thing to take into account, the power of form itself and the cultural weight of literary forms and how they influence the way we understand. I don't know how to put this, instead of going back to a traditional split between form and content, but the cultural weight of utopias as texts point toward the idea of perfection and stability and a kind of balance that is the opposite of narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is sort of, I know that, more recent utopias tried to deconstruct this idea. I think Ursula Le Guin is a very good example of that, especially in The Dispossessed, which I think it's a huge feat because she presents a utopia that actually works, which remains attractive for the reader, while still showing that it's not perfect, that needs development. I think that's the thing. We'll never reach utopia. While dystopias are more dynamic and problematic because they are more dynamic. So I think that might be one of the, let's say, discursive advantages of working with dystopias as texts. They have fissures. They open up. This in between is
Yeah, of course. I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying. Of course, I think, and you were doing it implicitly, I think you would have to make a difference between classical utopias.
Sure.
A little bit in the same way we make a distinction between classical dystopias and critical dystopias, and classical utopias and critical utopias like Le Guin's. Where, the more recent, or even Kim Stanley Robinson, for example, is one of the few writers who still writes, utopian science fiction. They go towards that open utopia, so they refuse that closed narrative, the static narrative that you find in more classical utopias. Dystopias are more frustrating to some extent, right? Or at least that's my experience with, when teaching dystopias, or the short stories that I teach, to my students. There are no easy answers. There are no, clean, clear paths. And so sometimes, the readers are kind of frustrated, in that. But I think that that's at the same time, the strength and the attractiveness of dystopias.
Yeah, I would agree completely. You mentioned in your answer, again, the different views that, or the different dystopias that can be produced according to the different contexts in which they are written or filmed. And I have a question from Pedro Sassi, which has to do with this. He wonders where, I don't know if you can answer this, when the first dystopias in Italy were produced, when they appeared, and whether they are historically connected to Mussolini's fascist movement.
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not much of a reader of Italian literature, despite the fact that I'm Italian. I have to say, although I've been reading more, but I have to say that I've been reading more contemporary dystopian narratives. I don't think, I cannot remember. From what I've read, I don't think there are dystopias written specifically produced at the beginning of fascism. I think they're more recent in Italy as a genre. But I would have to get back to you on that. There are a couple of very good books by Simone Brioni and Daniele Comberati. They've been working on Italian science fiction, Italian utopian and dystopian literature, and also Marco Malvestio. So there are books coming out on Italian literature, but I'm not, I'm a little ashamed, but I don't know much about that.
I find myself in the same situation. I mean, my reading of dystopia is much more connected to the Anglophone world. It's only recently that I have been trying to focus on our national production, but I think it's interesting to do this detour, precisely to say how.
It's important, I think, because I mean, I also feel in a way obligated to look at my own tradition, because in a way, how can I say, it's kind of easy to be critical, right, of other countries, other traditions, and it's kind of important also to look at your own stuff. So I've been looking a little bit more, but I have to say that I worked on one of the novels that I actually quoted. The covers was on the slides. One of the novels by Niccolò Ammaniti. It's called Anna, and it's been translated also in English. So I mean, it can be read also in English, and it's an interesting dystopian about a virus, but it was written, few years before the pandemic. So it's become, of course, more interesting recently, and because of our situation. Sorry, but I kind of interrupted you.
No, it's fine. Yeah, and I think this, what I was trying to say is that this detour, I think, and the difference we can perceive in trying to correlate national dystopias producing different national environments or contexts from the Anglophone model, which is still the paradigm to a large extent, help us also see a little bit more clearly the formal aspects of dystopia, how it works as a text, as discourse in terms of its rhetorical effects, and so on. So I think that's why I try not to feel too guilty about returning to national literature after studying more extensively the literature produced in the United States and Great Britain, especially. Regarding this, I also have a question by Daniela de Souza Mendonça, who asks, what does Professor Baccolini think of the idea of investigating a representation of female characters present in critical dystopias from the perspective of feminist narratology, which I think is she's trying to link precisely the formal aspect of dystopia as a text and feminist criticism.
Yeah, well, I think it certainly it would certainly be a very interesting project. I know that there are some PhD projects on on narratology and feminism. I'm not sure whether it's exactly about the representation of female characters, but taking into account, I know there's a person whose name I'm forgetting right now, in Mexico, that is working on that. So in case, I'll be happy to give more. But yes. it would certainly be a welcome addition.
And I have a sort of a follow-up question from Samuel Hidge, who asks, Professor, do you think the female dystopian protagonist is usually portrayed in a different light than the male one? Do they engage with the dystopian world or with hope in any particular way? And that's something very interesting, I think, too. Why this focus on the female protagonist that we see in more recent dystopias, especially in its young adult version, where if you take the major young adult dystopias, they are, I think most of them have female
protagonists. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, it's always difficult to generalize, of course, you know, and a lot depends on the writers. There's, I would say that you know, one of the issues that I would raise in addressing this question, or that I would use, is the idea of stereotypes, you know, and how much you know, a writer wants to go against a certain idea of a stereotypical femininity. So, and then, of course, how much he or she falls back into, you know, counter stereotypes or traditional stereotypes. Anyway, I mean, again, it's kind of risky, but I think that that's certainly one of the elements in choosing. In choosing to focus one story on female protagonists. The other element of all these, as Professor Cardozo said, I think there's a difference between young adult dystopias, and then the kind of dystopias I was talking about. I mean, the ones I was talking about, they all center on reproductive rights. So obviously they focus on female characters, and whereas I think it's interesting that the female dystopia, the young adult female dystopias, somehow choose female protagonist. Unfortunately, I mean, I don't know if it's an unfortunately or not, but I think that one of the reasons of the female protagonist might be that women read a lot more than men. You know, if you look at you know, publishing history and studies, and so it's probably, despite the fact that science fiction for a long time, or you know, it's been associated with you know, with boys and a literature that appeals to boys in particular, I think there might be a turn also in readership, and so that might be one of the reasons. Then, of course, you know, there once again we face the problem of, once something is successful, then we have, you know, 20 novels that pretty much tell the same story with little changes and so forth. But in terms of you know, of differences, in terms of hope, or in terms of rebellion, I think it would be you know, off the top of my head, I would have difficulties right now to find to pinpoint differences. You know, I think it all depends on you know, on who's writing.
Actually, I have the impression that young adult dystopias, especially the ones with female protagonists, tend to be closer, more explicitly critical dystopias. More often than in, let's say, adult dystopias, they have an open ending, or they point more explicitly to the possibility of political change than what we could call adult, more mainstream dystopias, which I find interesting. I don't know if that's connected also with the fact that they have female protagonists, or their connection with their specific public. I don't know if you. Anyway, this is just actually a comment. I'll be moving around because I have to connect my cell phone. My battery is running low.
Certainly more critical dystopias. Sometimes a little too apprehending, I think, a little too comforting for my taste. But that's but that again probably goes along with the idea of what is appropriate for young adults and children. It goes with the idea of children's literature that you cannot disturb children too much.
Although they are very disturbing, I would say.
Oh yeah,
very violent, and
absolutely.
Hunger Games is really astonishing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, let me. Sorry about this, everyone,
okay.
And especially Professor Baccolini. It's just I had to improvise a little bit with my internet connection.
No
today.
Problem. I think it's amazing that we're.
Yeah, that's one of the advantages of online communication, that this is possible in the first place. I also have a question by our colleague, Professor Angela Diaz. Is also a member of our study group, and she asks, Professor Baccolini, don't you think that nowadays the eco-dystopias are more significant in recent works than the political dystopias?
Yeah. Yes, I think there's a lot of very interesting work being done on environmental issues and the climate change crisis and everything. They're certainly more significant, and what I would say is that they're equally political, because dealing with climate change, you're raising a number of issues like climate justice, migration, discrimination, again, gender issues, poverty, so some of the eco-dystopias I think can be extremely political and extremely important and significant today. So yes, absolutely.
And again, just a comment. It seems to me that eco-dystopias also offer the opportunity, again, to, it's not really an opportunity, they are in a way a good example of how, again, dystopias can articulate. Sorry.
That's okay.
Can articulate.
I think I lost you. I don't know if you. I don't know if you can hear me, or.
Yeah, I think Professor Andre have lost the connection, and
okay.
We're soon. Let's wait a minute to see.
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
And I thank you for the answer for the question about the Italian dystopias.
Thank you for your question. I'm sorry that it wasn't much of an answer.
No problem at all.
I think I lost the.
Oh boy. Are you hear me, Professor?
I can hear you. Sorry, if I click on the camera, I mute myself for some reason. I don't know why. But can you hear?
Yeah, I can hear you. I think some kind of problem with your webcam.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe the Windows disconnected.
Yeah, the camera disconnected itself. I'm sorry.
But no problem. We
I
continue.
Yeah,
we have only 2 minutes into the end. So okay.
Right. It asked me to restart the computer, so I don't think it's worth it.
Yeah,
otherwise,
no
sorry about that.
No problem. I asked the question about the Italian dystopias because I studied the Brazilian dystopias, and here one of our first waves of dystopian fiction production was in the years of the Brazilian military dictatorship.
Oh, okay.
In the 80s. So I
so
thought
it's fairly recent.
Yeah, it's recent. We have some precursors of this genre, but the most popular mainly in the 80s and before.
And are there dystopias being written today?
Today, yes.
Is it popular?
We will have today a session with 3 writers of contemporary dystopias in Brazil.
Oh wow! Okay.
And
yeah,
I think as you were talking, in this moment specifically, we are having a kind of explosion of dystopian fiction here in Brazil too. I think because this moment of crisis, not only climatic but political, economic.
Oh yeah. If there is one thing, is that dystopia really is linked to the historical context. I mean, as a genre, you cannot really separate it from the political historical context. So
yeah. One moment, I think Andrea is trying to talk with me in the. Yeah, he told me that his cell phone become without charge.
Oh, okay.
He's trying to come back to end the session.
Okay, sure.
And sorry by my English. I was not supposed
perfect.
to be talking in English. It's not my. I mean, I'm not English student,
major,
and I work with.
Yeah, but your English is fine.
Thank you. Okay, I will ask Sam to put a question up for the public here. Thank you, Sam. And Rejani asked, Baccolini, could you please speak a bit more about the critical dystopia in the water cure?
Okay. I have to the water. I'm confused. I'm getting confused. I've read so many lately, and the water cure is the one.
Okay. Andrea was back.
Sorry. Okay. Hi. In the meantime, my camera disconnected. So, I'm sorry.
And I'm sorry too, because
I will
I
pass the
dropped
talk to
out
Andrea
for some reason.
again, and I will go to the backstage.
If I put the camera on, I actually mute myself. So I don't know what is happening. So, but so no, the question about the water cure, I've read it. There are some messages on the chat, but I don't know. They're in Portuguese, so I don't know how to read it.
No, don't worry.
Okay, sorry. I've read it a while ago, and I really have problems. I remember that there are novels that I found. I don't know. I wasn't completely impressed. Of all the novels I quoted, in a way, the one that really impressed me was more Red Clocks. A lot of the others are very repetitive and or not really not really well written to some extent. So okay.
André, are you here? Tá ouvindo a gente, André?
Eu tô.
Tá, acho que pode passar para a próxima pergunta, se quiser.
I'm getting a message.
Ou encerrar, né? A gente já está com tempo terminando.
Okay, let's just wrap up. Professor Baccolini, I don't know, I think you're experiencing technical problems as well. I think we both are.
Sorry,
going through our private technological dystopias today, yes. Unfortunately. It's about time to close up. I'd just like to ask a final question, just to wrap up. You've mentioned some of the risks of dystopia today. One of which is its appropriation by the media itself, how it becomes also a commodity, something that doesn't necessarily disquiet the reader, that offers a place, reality that the reader can visit and then close the book and things go back to normal. I was wondering what you think of the future of dystopia. What is the future of dystopia going to be? Or is there a risk that dystopias themselves will become impossible?
Oh, that's $1 million question. I think that we're probably gonna see, we'll continue to see, for a while, proliferation of, let's say, market dystopias, right? The commercial dystopia. But in the same way that we still have, and that we had for a while, good writers like Le Guin or Kim Stanley Robinson, I think that we there's hope for good works of literature, good dystopias. still being written in the future. You know, there might be only a few, you know, but I think we'll still have good dystopias in the future. I don't know if you're hearing me, because I see everything frozen.
No, I'm listening.
Oh, okay.
I think,
Okay.
it's coming through.
It's coming through. Okay. Okay. Sorry that I'm also experiencing, you know, like my computer says to restart everything. So.
Oops. Yeah. Technological dystopias for sure.
Technology, yes, absolutely, technological dystopia. So I think, unfortunately, you know, our society, you know, is going to provide, you know, inspiration. I mean, new stories, and so I don't see dystopias as disappearing. Perhaps there won't be that many that are really critical and well written and original, innovative, but I do think that, you know, they'll stay with us.
Yeah, unfortunately, as you mentioned, I think our societies are producing a surplus of matter for dystopias,
Yes.
including our computers, who seem to have a mind of their own, and a very contrary mind at that.
Yes. Yes, today in particular, you know.
Okay, Professor Baccolini, it was a huge pleasure, and it was really amazing to have this opportunity to listen to you and to talk with you and have this discussion. I feel we could stay here for the whole afternoon, but our time is up, and so we will wrap up now. Para quem estiver assistindo, agradeço muito a presença e as perguntas, e lembro que a gente vai ter uma outra mesa de debates às 2 horas, então, por favor, todos são convidados para que vocês possam assistir também. Muito obrigado e, mais uma vez, desculpe pelos problemas técnicos que a gente experimentou.